We are about to start this closing ceremony, and I can say that we are lucky today to have with us Professor Juan Arana. In the leaflet we've been handed out for this Congress, we can read a rather long part of his long curriculum. He told me yesterday, well, this year I have retired, and I could fancy him walking around in the city of Seville looking at the orange trees and smelling the orange blossom. But he has told me, well, I have retired, I've written sort of 12 articles, I'm finishing off the publication of a book to pay tribute to a friend. So Juan Arana is an amazing person. From the biographical point of view, I met him at a PhD course in our alma mater, the University of Navarre, and he persuaded me somehow to read one book on wormhole and science in general, something I had not done in my whole life. But that was such an incredible PhD course regarding the issues of matter, energy, etc., that maybe that in the end helped me, maybe not to understand one of Nolan's films, but at least to enjoy this world and also to find out that there's such a world that I need to know yet. He holds a PhD in the University of Seville. He is a full member of the Academy in Madrid, and he has been a professor at different Spanish and international universities. 20 monographies, 250 chapters in books, articles in scientific magazines, and as far as I can say as a participant, I can say that he is a wonderful speaker. So, without further ado, I give the floor to him with the title Transhumanism and Conscience. Well, if you allow me, Javier, I think I am the lucky one because I'm here with you this afternoon and I am making the most of your patience because you are still here, and congratulations because you are still here. And thank you all for inviting me, thank you for having me, and thank you to all the team who has organized wonderfully this Congress, particularly Maria Lacalle, Elena Postigo, and Olivia Núñez, who have actually chosen me, and I think we should not waste more time with preambles and prefaces. So if you agree with me, I will kick off and I will read so that I can stick to the time allotted. So I have a PowerPoint presentation, although I don't really know how to launch this. Okay, here I have it with me. And something magical should happen now. Okay, there it is. Shall I start? Yes, please. Right, so let's wait until we have the PowerPoint presentation. No pressure at all. Okay, there we have it. Okay, there we go. Now the topic is transhumanism and conscience. To start with, I have read something and heard something about transhumanism, particularly these days, of course, about its promises, its arguments, its dangers and its threats. So, keeping a distance from the wave of opinions and data and trying to avoid emotional contamination, the global impression I have withdrawn is that of a pandemonium. So much is said in favor and particularly against. So much is urged to favor its coming and also to avoid the catastrophe it represents that sometimes one doesn't really know what to stick to. Undoubtedly, my perspective is partial because when I am invited to take part in an event on this issue, most of the people I hear go against, with some nuances that go from the reasoned disapproval to the apocalyptic announcement of a dark era with some traits of the Mordor of the Lord of the Rings. So the citizen is urged to oppose to what is considered a lethal threat. If we go to a congress of other nature, congresses I'm not invited to, probably I would have heard voices that have nothing to do with Cassandra's laments. I imagine that the ambience there is that of an euphoria, because their supporters, far from showing transhumanism as a dystopia, they don't even consider it an utopia, because they conceive it rather as a reality that is already an imminent reality that will impose with the strength of a tsunami. Now, Marxisms of late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century claimed that their socialism was not an utopian one, but rather a scientific one. With them, with this is what this new movement ties in with, because it is introduced as to proclaim what the science will give us in the future. Now, the difference is that now we have lost the messianic accent that was prevalent before. Now, the revolution that is announced will not require from the promoters a sacrifice, or that some generations will sacrifice themselves in the altar of the future. It is not in the battlefield, and maybe the revolutionary strike. It is not there that we will live the forced future of the planetarian evolution. All the opposite. Laboratories, university faculties, and board of directors of companies will actually be the stage of a series of changes that are announced specific initially, although that's not what they will be like ultimately. This time the social turn will not come bottom to top, but rather top to bottom, understanding that the top is not so much making a reference to the traditional powers, such as money or weapons, but rather to the push of a super intelligence that will enlighten itself, come what may, no matter who disapproves of it, and maybe we should also add, no matter who promotes it. So far from being an epic poem, many claim the coming of transhumanism as a theorem, as an automatism. If that was the case, we would really be by the end of history and not when Fukuyama forecasted it. The only revolution would be in the development of the preludes, which would be where we should be initially now. Now, the question wouldn't be what is going to happen, but rather how and when. Now, this scenario I am describing maybe can only be applied to the transhumanism, the strong transhumanism, tying it with the extreme version of artificial intelligence. That transhumanism is a much more anti-Christian religion, because if somehow it was supported by the reason, it would be absurd that God had reincarnated in such an ephemeral creature as a person. Nevertheless, we have here a surprising point of convergence. And like romantic revolutions such as the Marxist one, transhumanist one indicates that the rudder of history is not in the hands of humanity. The Christian knows that history is in the hands of God, and that we have the alternative of either to collaborate or to go against a strength that overpasses us. The transhumanist believes that no one can stop the wheel of technoscience, no matter how much one tries to speed it up or to slow it down. Nick Bostrom is one of those who clearly apprehended this unavoidable character of the transhumanist prophecy. Although he, Bostrom, thinks at the same time that it is possible to catch the benevolence of in such a way that it does not turn us into waste matter of the progress. It is maybe worth the while to consider that maybe the future will have pity on us, as we sometimes take pity on panda bears. Sometimes even a super machine to do clips could even erase us from the planet in the blinking of an eye. For a long time, the so-called Asimov laws have been proclaimed, underlined clearly. According to the first one, none of our inventions should be programmed to hurt humans. It would be well, we could imagine asking for a wish in front of a fairy godmother, but as Fostrom said, it is not possible to put in the mind of an artificial intelligence machine, no matter how progressed it is, the concept, the analogical concept of harm that we humans manage. So no matter how hard to do this, that will flow into a fiasco in the near future. Ultimately, what happens is, as what happens in The Monkey's Paw by William Jacobs, the formulation of any wish interpreted ad literam goes against the intention, the implicit intentions of who expressed it. The cry mum asks for the return of the died child, but what knocks on the door is a corpse. Therefore, the ingenuity of the self-writers is there. Oliver Sichel, for instance, wants that the vaunted Asimovian laws are recorded in all microprocessors and they become a sort of a constitutional principle that is prior to any other code, when Asimov himself just created them to show how problematic they were and the high number of literary ideas that their perverse collateral effects could cause. It is very difficult to take on the role of a god. Actually, the only sure thing is that if we try to do it, we will repeat the history that Goethe tells in The Sorcerer's Apprentice. Even transhumanists suspect it rather clearly. And Wright Kurzweil says in The Singularity is Near, in that book, that nanotechnology will provide us immortality, doing so that through our veins and arteries microscopic robots would flow instead of red and white blood cells. Nevertheless, in that same book, he crushes again the inconvenience that our bodies, our organisms, will be more vulnerable to IT virus than they are now to the biological virus. I didn't get the impression that he manages to sort out that minor inconvenience. Now, the futurology of many transhumanists has a petrol tank full of holes. If this seems ambiguous, I'll try to look at it from a different perspective. The impact of science and technology on the human being and its biological identity will be huge in the short term. Now, this is the strength of transhumanists, but, and this is the weakness, it is rather uncertain the possibility that some circles of power or some countries or even humanity in general control those changes and address it towards the common good. You understand it as you want, the common good. But the train of change is running, but no one drives that train. There is a rugby scrum where no one prevails above anyone. Now, a minimum consideration of the situation says that even if a government or global authority in the end imposed itself, the efforts to improve this planet would be completely precarious. The quantity of alternatives is immense by the prosthesis of robotization, but most of them are adverse to the future of our species and even to that of other species replacing ours. The time that nature has taken to achieve so well adapted and balanced organisms one with the other, like the ones that at the moment inhabit this planet, has been that of millions and millions of years, and that with an efficient filter that was the natural selection. As a clear contrast to this, the clear exposition of transhumanism, Kurzweil, aims at transcending biology in a sufficiently short deadline in such a way that he himself reaches immortality, although he is in the third age and he suffers from diabetes. Of course, it is at the height of blindness. I could look at the all those details of transhumanist projects, I could do it, but it has been done several times in the past, and particularly it has been mentioned in this Congress. I think that the reviews of some critics are very accurate, but it is not easy to believe that we can act or press a button and stop the experiment, since we have not even been capable of controlling the emissions of CO2 or other fossil fuels. In spite of the fact that we should agree, and we actually agree on this, then how could we stop a movement that it is actually looking at the improvement of human species? Almost no one wants to say no or to object to curing diseases. We all aim at being better, socially blended, and to be better, but no paradigm of perfection can be seen, no moment where it is advisable to say, okay, this is it, I will not cross this line. To do that, we would need to have a clear concept of essence or of human nature. Some, we still believe in that concept, although we have underlined it many times, but most of us have doubts, and in the philosophical sphere, there is an idea in the air of abandoning that concept. Thus, we have hopped on a train to run away from the evils that were persecuting us, but we don't know where we should stop that train, and we wouldn't be able to achieve that even if we suspected that we are on the verge of creating monsters or enemies whose first providence would be to put an end to us. So I assume that by now it is clear that strong transhumanism is not what I really advocate for, but the situation is rather complex, and we cannot rule out the difference between them and us. First, it is not easy to define oneself as an anti-something. It would be maybe easy to find an identity that transcends objecting to someone or something. Then, in addition to this, in the field of those who object to transhumanism, different thoughts are meeting, and political ideas that themselves would object to everything. So, pardon my French, but the collective of those critics, more than being a group, has become almost a group of crickets. And actually, the question of transhumanism is said to become the future something different to those partisans, what those partisans say. According to some experts, progressists, conservatives, and even materialists and spiritualists, that will be all dated. Laurent Alexandre states that confrontation between ones and the others will actually preside all the ideological debate in future years. It will probably be the case, although by now the polarizations are rather childlike. The only solution will be to look altogether for less simplistic solutions. I think that the bioconservative solution, which should be the one that I initially advocate for, lacks some voluntarism that is rather special. I must say that myself, I have delved into this, but now I think that it is a problem, because it is not productive to appeal the moral sense of people and to plan the battle ahead as if it was basically an ethical challenge, or if you want, a history of the good and the evil. Now, opposing the personal interest to the collective interest and the interests of the present to those of the future can inspire symbolic changes and inspire the young, but the subsequent mobilization will be short because it will crash against the urgencies of the everyday life. Now, if myself or someone close to me, we unfortunately have a degenerative illness, it would be an act of heroism to vote for acts that can, technology acts that can give us some hope. although things falter and things go sideways, maybe we'll still go and advocate for it, particularly if we think that others will pay for the consequences of failure. We will hear from those who magnify the possible new facts and who minimize the potential risks, and this can be applied to everyone. As for the conventional leftists, they will have serious problems to adapt to the future context. Traditionally, the left has fought for new times and to leave behind a time of oppression, but now it finds that those who fly the flag of progression are technocrats and capitalists, so much so that it sees itself on the verge of stepping to reaction. And then it will not be easily accepted by the traditional reactionaries, because actually some of them will oppose to the other side just to oppose someone. Decades will fly by until the new political arena settles down, and maybe by then it will be rather late to change the course of history. Maybe these considerations are rather speculative, but there are clear signs that the processes of modification, of human modification already ongoing, will hardly be slowed down. Maybe they look in what transhumanist theories point at. Well, that's a different story. But there are some similarities with this, and it has not been possible to stop similar cases. The most recent ones are the ones having to do with the development of nuclear armament, and although I will not dive into details, in this case it affected reasons that had to do with the future of humanity, and the effort to calm down theories and to control technologies have not prospered. Regarding the atom, the arms race in the Second World War and the Cold War prevented citizens to have anything whatsoever to do with this business. But the atoms that actually played an important role did nothing to conjure the threat, but for some minor exceptions such as that of Isaac Rabi in the United States, Max Born in Great Britain, and maybe, although this is not clear, Bernard Heisenberg in Germany. And all that in spite of the announced pacifism of Albert Einstein. The most clear example and dramatic one is that of Oppenheimer, who simply opposed to the hydrogen bomb until a procedure was shown to him that he thought was, between inverted commas, nice. And that's why Oppenheimer principle has been detailed, according to which any principle is taken until its last development without looking at the potential side effects. In parallel to this, when the intervention of the genome of animal plants was possible thanks to the discovery of the recombinant DNA, a group of big scientists meeting in Asilomar agreed to launch the combination of genes from different species, and that agreement only slightly was respected. 20 years later, more powerful techniques emerged, such as the CRISPR-Cas9, and a meeting was organized in Washington that actually was enabled to agree on a comparable moratorium and actually allowed to continue the addition of genomes with human embryos if they were used to provoke if they were not used to provoke pregnancies. Soon, He Jong-kui challenged those suggestions, creating the first human beings. Years have gone by, and this has been silenced somehow, but it would be very naive to think that no more steps will be taken in this direction, and rather fast. Now, conservationists have wanted to object to the principle of Oppenheimer, the so-called ritual of Asilomar, saying that not all that is technically possible should be ethically acceptable. It's hard to conceive something that is more obvious, but the question is, will those who launched it actually develop it? Well, maybe not. The Prometheus-like effort is very big without analyzing its consequences. I don't want us to stop signing and to stop going to strikes and to parades for what is prudent and reasonable. What I do is to advocate that all that is not enough, and that we should not just content to the ethics, because there is disagreement about what one think is good and others not. Many relevant stakeholders just admit the legal limits, and some not even that. Plus, some laws can be violated, and that means that in one country, in a specific experiment is not allowed, well, they take it to a different country where that is allowed. At least we would need a common legislation for the whole planet, and to give enough coercive power. But both the United Nations and the Court of Justice in The Hague are unfortunately unable with anything that has to do with genes. And that is actually excruciating, because we cannot wait for tomorrow or to the day after tomorrow to have that. So it should have been for today, or even better, for yesterday. Although the everyday man knows what is, in general terms, what is good and what is not, it perceives it intuitively and effectively and affectionately, not in a reasonable way. But when it is important to differentiate, they falter. There is a minority of those who are for the change and who actually easily create lobbies. Now, that group of activists has transferred to techno-science the feeling that are usually reserved to religion. Alexandre described them as such, and I quote, the gospel of the humanists spreads like gunpowder. The religion, the transhumanist religion, could impose its law in several decades, and the apostles are actually the new lords of the world and the new laws of history. End of the quote. Maybe this sort of describes the soteriological aspect of the movement. Many don't trust this fever, but not having anything else to give an answer to the big doubts of existence, well, that's what people stick to. That's why I think it is necessary to stick to the code of reason, all this enthusiasm and vehemence. In other words, to overcome the inertia that has been settled down and to object to the semi-religious enthusiasm of those who just trust anything that has to do with transhumanism, we have to focus on something more than a do-goodism. Only if we manage to overcome this current lack of moralization, and if we manage to settle down the faith in ourselves, we will have the guts to defend ourselves with efficiency. I'll try to sum it up, and I'll try to summarize an emergency ideology. If transhumanism manages to charm spirits, it's because it suggests a very serious set of problems that actually dig deep in humans. Jorge Luis Borges indicates with finesse that the attractiveness of literature actually is in awakening in the reader a feeling that in the end doesn't happen. So most of promises or threats of transhumanism will not probably become a reality, but it is clear that they have awakened in the audience the idea that very soon an element of infinity is about to arrive, what Kurzweil calls singularity, Bostrom superintelligence, and other authors differently. But when arguments indicated are examined clearly, in the end they have the structure of an inverted pyramid, the same one that has been clearly used many times to perpetrate frauds, financial frauds, and I'm not pointing at anyone. Maybe if we had the chance to multiply systematically by 2, by 3, or by 4 the earnings of any investment in the field of knowledge, and if we invested them once and again, after 50 or 60 cycles, we would be so full of knowledge as the inventor of chess, who asked for a grain of rice in the first square and 2 with the second, etc., etc. But the prophets of creed actually don't want to multiply by 64 this, but actually all the times that the cosmic space provides. Frank Tipler wrote long ago a book that I think precedes strong transhumanism, entitled The Physics of Immortality. And after reducing to a long list of bytes each of the human existences, a crazy race started to preserve and to enhance all that, and that meant expropriating all the energy and the matter available to keep actively all the corresponding repositories. It projected sort of a black hole to store data, which in the end would devour the planet, the solar system, the galaxy, and at the end of the day, the whole universe. Now, which consequences can we withdraw from this? Clearly, the cause of an activity linked to divinization can be analyzed. And when an eschatological horizon opens up, the transhumanist gives a priority to a new reality. In a rather different way, some pay the effects promised with capital provided by new clients that are attracted themselves by the new lure. The business could be prolonged never endlessly if the number of stupid people with money would be endless, but nor the planet nor humanity is endless, and that's the weak point. Some talk about endless list of techno-reality. If those who organize shady financial systems persuaded people that they should accept the benefits not 1 year down the line but 20 years down the line, maybe their days are could be turned into big palaces and not into prisons, high security prisons. Actually, this depends on the quantity and the duration of the faith they awaken. Our transhumanists appeal 4 factors to pinpoint it: molecular biology, robotics, nanotechnology, and the science and the computation science. The first one is, is a jack in the box that any time can become a Pandora's box, as we have heard it recently with SARS-CoV-2. The progresses in robotics are being slower than the promoters thought at first, so much so that promoters are now abandoning this kind of business, as Google did when selling in 2017 Boston Dynamics to Masayoshi Gizon. Nanotechnology progressive, clearly fast, but still there's a long way to go. And unfortunately, the susceptibility to virus and attacks online, and also the danger that users are affected, turns them into a potential threat as dangerous or more than the one coming from the biological front. Computational sciences are actually the ones that second the best those who are adhered to the new faith, thanks to the new persistence of the Moore's law. For 50 years, the calculation power has increased and the cost has been reduced at an exponential level. But serious doubts have emerged that this can be kept as such for a long time. The trust of Moore himself, who trusted that law, faltered in 2010, and Intel, who is the main stakeholder or the main manufacturer of microprocessors, only extends it to the 2023, very soon. Initially, the 7 nanometers processors have the minimum size possible, and according to the head of development of this company, Simon Vinyals, and I quote, "We are very close to the physical limits and chemical limits," end of the quote. To sum up, the idea to adorn the humanity with the attributes of humanity is condemned to failure, according to any reasonable argument that is worth being taken into account. It is yet to be defined if at least the objective of the superhuman is possible. If it is possible, it would be necessary to analyze if that superhuman will still be superhuman in any sense, and if towards the mere humans they will have a nice or hostile attitude. That would entail dramatically cutting the ambitions of transhumanists and also cuts the wings to the goals of the movement, because at the end of the day, to some extent, life expectancy, energy available per capita, capacity to communicate and to move, we are to that extent superhumans if we compare ourselves with our grandparents. But if we pay attention to courage, to industriousness and capacity to suffer, we are rather degrading to infrahumans if we compare ourselves to with our grandparents. Now, we think that the life expectancy and the capacity to communicate will increase, but the number of movements or even the energy available might not improve, although maybe we learn to manage them better and also to control the environmental problem. Therefore, it is not crazy to foresee that our offspring will be superhumans, or at least little superhumans. Now, the problem here is that they are biologically our sons or our grandchildren. Well, yes, they will be superhumans. At the end of the day, we don't think that we are post-apes, do we? It's necessary to appeal science fiction to at least hold some hopes for the future. It doesn't look as if the ideas of having children in the future comes from the side of cybers, of robocops. The possibility of these being a reality has not yet been defined. Marvinsky, promoting artificial intelligence, and who has died recently, and therefore he couldn't see the promised land by transhumanism, sort of a Moses of the new times. He warned that genetical systems were not defined to pinpoint a maintenance in the very long term. Now, promises or threats of a replacement come from a different side: the creation of supercomputers, self-sufficient supercomputers, and the alteration of genomes by genome modification to the extent that our offspring will not be recognizable and that they overcome the barriers that separate species. Now, these barriers between species is a way of talking, because in the everyday life we don't see those real barriers. Probably there was a hen generated by the old example of the previous species, or Homo habilis created by the Homo erectus, the last Homo erectus. In the case of humans, it's not clear that the biological perspective can explain it all, and it is not licit to exclude that back then there was not a disruptive element. That cannot be ruled out, because both the mental and the cultural aspect, they don't have barely any possibility to compare in today's realities inhabiting the earth. Philosophers, who are clearly materialists, have excluded, dogmatically rather, this leap. A leap that is actually not possible between the human species and other biological species. But, hey, transhumanists, although most of them tend to be naturalists, most of them, they advocate for a line of rupture in the gradation of life, because supercomputers or superhumans they project would result from specific moments in laboratories.
From the philosophic point of view, transhumanism is not going to concern seriously those that just support the thesis. Well, and I join them, the thesis that in man there are aspects that can't be explained by the procedures of science of nature. When we start from this assumption, or if we reach somehow to this, the whole transhumanistic approach becomes chimera without any meaning. Thus, to accept the naturalistic thesis is a condition. That thesis that man can be explained at 100% with the procedures of natural sciences is a condition of possibility for a transhumanistic process. This is at the end to break down the human reality in order then to equal it and overcome it with the help of molecular biology or other means. But this is not too clear. That's why it's not too clear how we can be naturalistic and at the same time impregnate the transhumanism, because the naturalist defends that in definitive everything that is human is perfectly well explainable by science today or tomorrow. I say that because there are many who declare naturalistic and they oppose to transhumanism, when I think that somehow it is the natural conclusion. Although, well, if science is able to explain absolutely everything, why not of imitating it and even overcoming it? The objections of the naturalists opposed to transhumanism tend to outline what is remote, the state of the science, the pharaonic cost of the project, how inconvenient to be able to force the science machine with too demanding goals, the injustice of producing aims that will be at the reach of rich countries, etc., etc. Reasons that are guided by the prudence, economy, or social equality, but not allegations relative to the to an ethical objections. For the naturalism, there is not in man any element of superior nature that is driving unsolvable differences with respect to the other natural beings, animated and non-animated. That's why we have to recognize what Peter Singer says when he states that he don't see why a newborn child is going to have more rights than an adult pig. And I don't want to say that all the naturalists should be affiliated to transhumanism, where there are voices like that are more authorized than myself to comment on it. But they have to take into account the time and cost. But the non-naturalistic, like myself, has to reach further and put at the service more vigorous reclutation means. This doesn't have, they have to defend the superiority of human beings on the production of the sciences from any point of view. It is obvious that a pocket calculator is adding better than a world calculator of mental calculation, and that a pen drive has also better resolution. The only indispensable is to argument with success that there is something in man that definitely is outside of the reach of natural science that we have right now, and the one that exists now and the one to come. That is not too hidden or too subtle, and that is helpful to set the human identity, existing identity, in such a way that it sets difficult distances with the rest of the inhabitants or the possible conquest of the coming science. Many criticists will object that I want to lift again the idea of essence applied to men, giving mystic connotations. I'm not so convinced about the caducity of the notion of essence, but this is not the battle I'm going to start right now. It will be enough to tell you that those who refute the essences, normally they resuscitate them immediately, or they want to have different identity traits, constant parameters, peculiarities, morphological patterns, etc., etc. Any of them is valid, and in this way we can prevent another terminological dispute. I don't want to define the essence of man nor any of its workers. Only the notions of logic and mathematics admit to be defined like that in a non-ambiguous manner. Following the example of Popper, I want to be clear and specific only as far as one can, and it's not too often too much. I'm not being original. The originality is very convenient in art and literature, but in philosophy it's overvalued. And this doesn't justify that we just repeat what others have said. For instance, those who talk about the reason, understanding, and will and effectiveness of men. Of course, these are attributes that are found in our species with very peculiar accents. But nevertheless, I feel that some of those who are living and technical artifacts possess characteristics that at least are remotely related with ours. So there is enough reason to augment the comparison, the explanation, and also maybe supplementation. It wouldn't be meaningful if I wanted to mention the challenge of the Turing test if the machines wouldn't be rational. Sometimes I could say they are too much. And the mode in which the leopard is throwing itself on its prey to see that the mothers have affect. It's just enough to see the tiger mom licking the small ones, and also with hungry wolves. Anyone who has a dog perceives that there are many things that that dog understands. We could nevertheless add that animals and things do not reason, understand, or feel as we do. I will accept that to be accused of racist at this respect. I sustain that a human race is different. And I say that this is the point on which my whole idea is. I'm not vitalist and I don't see objections to try a relation of animals and plants, but in the case of man, naturalization, the scientific and natural explanation is stop there because there is something in him that prevents it, something that is not substantive but adjective. We take out feet from physics and when we reason, but when we reason consciously, not when we understand, but when we understand with our consciousness, not when we want, but when we want with conscience, not when we perceive, but only when we perceive and are aware. I have been told that the machines and animals can also be conscious and even self-conscious, at least those that are complex enough or those that are evolved enough. Maybe this is so if we give to the word conscious, cognitive. We are only aware of what we know. Maybe somebody that knows is also already conscious. But at any rate, the word conscious is just I know this or that, but I'm aware of this and that. I look at my image in the mirror, so I am self-conscious as well. But nevertheless, the word conscience has also, according to the Dictionary of Royal Academy, other connotations. The self-conscience of some robots consists on moving one of their pieces according to a certain pattern and identifying the visual field of the camera what objects can they identify. If we have an imitator in the middle, we can have a difference in the visibility of the machine. What is the difference between this is that the last one requires a second supplementary act of knowledge, whilst the cabal conscience, we have to see in the mirror, and the mirror, it's me. But this smart intelligence, one single act gives knowledge and concomitantly conscience. That's why consciousness is something that is objective and doesn't presuppose any dualism of any sort. Only in man do we have one single substance, and he knows, and he knows that he knows without having to look at any mirror or be reduplicated, nor to have a certain fire tongue due to it. Somehow it has become auto-transparent. It's able to refer everything that happens in as he persists with his conscience. It's not mandatory for him to do that. We can say, like Churchill, he referred that to the act of smoking. Stopping being conscious is the most easy thing in the world. We are doing it constantly. How do I know that animals and the supercomputers lack conscious? Well, I don't know that. I don't have any evidence that one of you had to have it. I'm just certainly of mine. I suppose that you are also aware of yours. So both you and me, we do risk to bet that it also accompanies any interlocutor able to sustain with us a brief personal talk. For everything related to ancient conscience, we're forced to judge with analogy. One could develop Descartes that he thinks something with respect to Turing's test, but also consciously. Having a very well-developed nervous system or an electronic circuit of first level doesn't guarantee, although it's not too much there either, the conscious brain and supports the consciousness with the world. To show its presence will facilitate the communication with other consciousness and extract from them the maximum benefit. But who knows? Maybe they are, even stones are aware, although there is no way of communicating with them and verifying that. As they don't have a mouth to talk and ears to listen, the hypothetical consciousness is going to do a solipsistic, very metaphysical monologues. And the non-human survival, chimpanzees included, have given until now unambiguous signs of the self-transparency that is required to have a consciousness as the human one. Independently of who has it and who doesn't, the only thing that I say is that conscience itself in no sense can't be explained by the past, present, nor future science, and thus it can be included in the agenda of a transhumanistic approach. Why do I say that? Because science is objective. It works with objective concepts, evidence, theorems, theories, mental products that don't have a double bottom. These, understood as product and not action of the human beings, prevents its content to go back on themselves to be seen from the side. They can't objectify the experience of being aware of themselves. The content of science can and should be reflected upon, but that reflection is not made by the science itself, but by the scientist by means of later actions of objectifying. And he is skilled to do that because he has conscience, whilst any science is perfectly devoid of any objective contamination. The conscience as to conscience is not part of the content of science because it's first condition for being possible. It's science, the one that is conscious, that gives rise to science and not the other way around. The conscience or awareness is something adjective, not substantive. It has nothing to do with the second substance. Let's call it spiritual substance, superimposed on the bodily one. The conscience is in man something that is accidental. That's why we try to, it takes a long time to acquire it and we lose it easily. The only essential to man is the attitude to reach it when we have the good conditions. And that's why there are still persons who can't exercise conscience or still do not do that or can't do it more. Although with all these limitations, it's even more important that the human sees that as a skill, because thanks to it we can spiritualize the mother substance, something that was absolutely natural, as the Australopithecus became a subject with spiritual conscience when the conscience gave it to him. Consciousness goes beyond what is cognitive. It's the self-knowledge that becomes in the self its owner. The subject at stake can be the owner himself, acquired this self-master that we call freedom, although it is not indispensable to be full. This type of freedom is the only one that is without any conditions and has very little to do with other sorts of pseudo-freedom that we have had fantasies from Hobbes to Levitt. The consciousness allows the field of, in the field of what is objective, we have the subjective that pops up, but not to lose in a narcissistic contemplation, but also as a concomitant addition that elevates what in itself was just a mere thing. We could say that the human self pays the price of the dignity through its dependency. It's not an absolute self and not a subsistent self. It is the self, in small letters, of a body, subject to all the mortgages of the matter, needs the neuronal activity and different delicate physiological balance. In that vital track is still at the service of the body that it is coding. an exercise in order to overcome all the physical impossibilities and open the ethical of the free disposal of oneself. Freedom is not attribute of the awareness. It belongs to the substance that bears it. In our case, the whole organic and conscious that we are. Conscious, in other words, is what makes us free, making us in one go through one single event in subjects of knowledge and subject of voluntary moral action. The dualism between the action that has created so many headaches is not only a mistake, it's a vicious approach that abandons the bodily in the arms of the physical determinism with the classical determinism and naturalism that is the renewed version. In spite of how my discourse has been intermingled, it's a speculation. Thanks to Descartes and René, we have seen that the presence among us of a subjective element is an empirical evidence that without any controversies. We know that that element is radically refractory to the type of objective explanation given by natural science. And this is an obstacle that the transhumanists could never overcome because this sticks to the resources of physics, chemistry, or biology. And in a more taxative manner, consciousness, and it will still be for science an unapproachable mystery due to the simple reason that it is not possible to build individuals using subjects as a raw material. As a mental experiment, we could say that we will be able to build molecule by molecule the whole nervous system of a human, that we will be able to increase by means of genetic engineering the efficacy of the neural circuits and the solidity of the psychosomatic constitution. And that's how we will be able to manufacture Paracelsus, but also typical monsters as Dr. Frankenstein. But the creature resulting in such assumptions, the resulting creature generates a consciousness is something as uncertain as to solve the enigma of why we have it, we humans. The theological perspective could contribute with shed some light at this respect, but here I have to stick to the philosophical one. And philosophy, as science, is forced to declare in this situation what Dubois Raymond did. Ignoramus and ignorabimus. And on the other hand, we know perfectly well right now how to close the sources of conscience, making the minds idiots or removing the brains from the bodies. If we still start touching in the brain and supplanting the action, human action with computational systems without soul, instead of a superconscious play and play out, we are going to have a desert of any conscious trace. Let's hope that never happens, but unfortunately, it will not be for they have been stopped in trying it. Thank you very much.
Más que medido. Excelente.
Well, Elena says we have time for 2 questions. We are getting a question from the internet. Yes. We have 2 questions. The first one is from Sister Veronica. It says, since transhumanism is on top of us, where do you think, or how do you think we can fight against this abhorrent school of thought? Well, I think that strong or radical transhumanism, that is the idea of creating bodies that are better than man, is a wild goose chase, but I think that it could be very dangerous for man. So our fight is not against transhumanism. Our fight is to make it possible for man to survive. So we should protect something that is so valuable to us which is, as I've tried to explain in my presentation, is our conscience in this respect of trying to own our own conscience, which is, of course, the summit of human beings, which is still subject to a series of conditions. But the idea is to rear up our heads, and it's like somebody who has been in a shipwreck and is trying to keep his or her head above water. And this is what we should also do. Thank you. There is a question from the floor. Thank you very much for this lecture, Professor. These 2 days have been very interesting. I want to congratulate the organizers and the different participants. And I wanted to mention something, because you're saying that what makes conscience different is the capacity to reflect. And phenomenology has a lot to say about this. So if this conscience that makes us different from machines, wouldn't it be, it could be made broader in as much as there is no person that is aware of anything? Yes, the problem is the constitution of self. There may be knowledge without the self. In fact, Popper spoke about objective knowledge. You can say that I think that the comments made this morning in this conference were very interesting, because one thing is to generate something that may be interpreted by a human being and can be considered to be knowledge, or saying that a machine is very smart because it does something that I think is, would help me checkmate my chess opponent, which is something I wouldn't have been able to achieve without the machine. But the service rendered by the machine is a service that's purely objective. There is nothing personal in it. And if there's a personal element missing, then you don't have the cherry on the cake, which is essential, because if you can't have a cherry on the cake, you can't have a second cake or a third cake. So machines are not just our competitors, they're basically our product. And conscience is at the basis of the development of machines, even if they are not conscious of it. And there's a sentence which is related to this. Most of the work we do, well, in 10 or 15 years' time, will be done by machines. And an economist was saying that we will have to learn to dance with machines. Well, we will have to learn to dance with machines, because machines cannot dance on their own. Because, you need other things. So what you need to do is stand behind the machines so that they still have a purpose, and so that they can still help generate knowledge. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Arana. Now we will hear from Professor Postigo, who has been the director of this conference. She is going to make a summary of what has been discussed during our conference. Thank you very much. Well, our conference is coming to an end. We have been reflecting on transhumanism from different perspectives, and very enriching ones, from philosophy, science, medicine, the law, politics, bioethics, family, sports, audiovisual communication, and theology, amongst others. The anthropological question has also emerged of who we are, and also epistemological questions have emerged. Can science respond to the desires and the longings of human beings? Also ethical questions. What should we do to become really human? And then what for? I think that this has been a very useful, practical exercise. And all of this has been possible thanks to you. It is really impossible for me to mention the different contributions that have been made by the speakers at the different sessions, and it would be oversimplify. It would be oversimplistic to do so. So, we will be uploading the minutes of the conference, and you will be able to read the different presentations. All of this will be possible from the month of July. I would like to thank you very much for your participation and your involvement. And we have said a lot more than transhumanism says. We have made many things that are really implicit. You have made them explicit. Ideologies and movements are ideas that have a purpose. But transhumanism is not aware of what these things are because it is not a philosophy. It is a praxis, as was said yesterday. And here many of those ideas were made explicit. The human being as a material being, the physical and psychic perception as a longing, the elimination of imperfect humans, transhumanism as an ideology or even as a secular religion, emphasizing the transformation of society through knowledge, science, and technology. Transhumanism as a desire to overcome the human body and achieve immortality. On Earth, this desire of immortality, this nostalgia for the infinite, has been mentioned by philosophers and artists throughout history. It is not a postmodern or a lay postmodern humanism as they define themselves, but, as I wrote in 2009, an anti-humanism which offers misleading targets, but which is based on the elimination of what is human to reach what is post-human. So it eliminates vulnerable and fragile people as worthless. Benedict XVI wrote in 2007, at present, bioethics, and I think this could be applied to other disciplines, bioethics is a field which is crucial for the cultural fight between the absolutism of technology and other forces. And what is at stake is the possibility of the comprehensive development of human beings. This is decisive. And the fundamental question here is whether man is a product of himself or whether he or she depends on God. Scientific discoveries in this field and the possibilities of technical interventions have grown so much that they seem to impose that we should impose a choice between the two possibilities, a reason open to transcendence or a reason embedded in immanence. This is a very important choice. And the same author focuses on this question, this decisive out. This means accepting that humans are not just one more object within natural entities, but we should be aware that awareness is a unique fact, and science and technology should be used in a responsible way at the service of people and common good. I want to remind you that the word to transhumanate was not Huxley, but Dante in the Divine Comedy. Dante reaches the paradise and looks at Beatrice, who's gleaming, a kind of transformation. She had undergone a kind of transformation. And so Beatrix, there she was, and my eyes were fixed upon her. And inside I tried to come up with an answer for this experience. And Dante took his gaze away from the sun, and the poet was such a loss that he suffered an impossible transformation. It was a transformation that was impossible to describe with human words. This is the transhumanation. So he didn't know whether he was in possession of his mortal body or he was in a different situation. I don't know whether Huxley read Dante or not when he coined the word transhumanism, but it is interesting what the transposition he made of the content, removing all its transcendent concept from it. So this is emptying of human beings in the beatific conception or the fullness or the immortality conception, and this is a kind of thirst of transcendence. So I think that we could say, in stricter senses, that transhumanism is a secular religion that wants to cancel man's condition of a creature. And this is a kind of mirage. We will still keep thinking of what it means to be humans, and we will still keep working on what transhumanism is. The Raison Abierta Institute will leave this door open to be able to continue this dialogue. I can't conclude without thanking the different speakers for their participation, for contributing their ideas which have enriched the conference so much. I also want to thank the Raison Abierta Institute, and I want to thank the team I have had helping me, and all the different departments involved in the organization of this conference, from the first to the last, to all of them, participants, both physically present and present online.